Welcome. I'm Gene Sperling. I'm Senior Advisor to President Biden and coordinator of the American Rescue Plan implementation. Thank you for joining us. The reason that the Emergency Rental Assistance Program has been both one of the most difficult and challenging American rescue plans, and yet among the most rewarding, humane, and historic ones, all emanate from the same single reality. Our nation had never had or even tried to build a national policy and national infrastructure around eviction prevention. The legislation that so many people watching and participating in this conference played a role in passing was in some ways audacious. It asked that many of you around the country and those of us in the Biden administration launched the startup of a first ever national infrastructure and eviction prevention in a decentralized way through over 400 brand new programs in every state, major city, and county in the middle of a pandemic. And it required a fierce race with time to get enough relief out to hard-pressed tenants and their landlords in time to prevent the feared tsunami of evictions when the CDC moratorium ended. Now, many of us know that in the early months, it was far from clear that we would win that race with time. Even by April, when over unprecedented 100,000 payments went out to rental households, we knew it was nowhere near the pace needed to prevent a heartbreaking spike in evictions. This life and death race with time meant there would be no time to wait for a year of reporting or future random controlled experiments. The only way forward was a constant feedback loop with those on the ground, including, and most especially, those who were the most critical of why funds were not getting out. That meant constant interaction with tenant groups, with those represented by the Low Income Housing Coalition, by grantees, landlords, brave legal service attorneys, and top experts. That feedback loop led us to quickly see issues of discrimination of those in federal housing, lack of direct help going to tenants when landlords refused to participate, and the deep human cost of complex and burdensome applications leading people to not get the relief they needed. We responded again and again to this information, to this feedback loop with new guidance in May, June, and August, calls and words, tough words from the president to those moving too slow, 3 White House summits on court diversion and right to counsel, and path-breaking calls to action by our Associate Attorney General and Attorney General at the Department of Justice. Listening and responding paid off. The pace of dollars and renters helped quadrupled by August. While 300,000 people normally receive eviction notices in a typical non-pandemic month, by August, we were getting payments to households that covered months and months of rent for over 500,000 renter households each month from August to December and beyond. The results we announced today are striking. Over 7 million multi-month payments to renter households have gone out already that have prevented evictions, utility shutoffs, and heartbreaking choices between rent and food and medicine. And instead of eviction filings spiking to 200 or 300% of historic averages, as many predicted, once the CDC moratorium ended, it has remarkably been 26% below historic averages in the full first 10 months since the eviction moratorium ended. And instead of payments being stalled or going out at too slow a pace, the overwhelming majority of ERA funds are now spent or committed. Now, before the ERA, the Emergency Rental Assistance, where were we on reform? There were only a handful of jurisdictions with the right to counsel for tenants, only a handful with the eviction diversion plans. Now, with the challenge from the administration and many of you and the use of emergency rental assistance dollars, we have given lasting reform a jump start. There are hundreds of states and cities, including Michigan, New Mexico, Texas, Delaware, New Orleans, Denver, Chicago, Boston, I could go on, that are building on the eviction diversion models piloted in places like Philadelphia. More and more jurisdictions are requiring right to counsel, working with our tremendous legal service corporations, while 99 law schools and hundreds of law firms answered the Biden administration's call to devote student clinics and pro bono programs to represent distraught tenants. Now, let me be as clear as I can be. This is in no way mission accomplished. No way. It would be a terrible mistake to not acknowledge and learn going forward from any and all things that could be legislated better or have been implemented better. It would be wrong to ever gloss over the countless thousands that did not get needed payments due to capacity constraints, burdensome applications, or just living in a low-performing jurisdiction. And as Tara Raguvier always reminds us, we have to ensure that as we make policy, we are listening to tenants and taking account of the power imbalance and hardship that so many face, and make sure those words and lessons are built into our policy now and going forward. All that said, it would be a huge mistake to not stop and recognize the magnitude of the success of this experiment in progressive and humane governance. Never before, never, not in the New Deal, not in the Great Society or War on Poverty, had there ever been a national policy or national infrastructure to prevent unnecessary evictions. The fact that this new policy and infrastructure was set up within months in the middle of a crisis, in the middle of a pandemic, and served 7 million at-risk households, overwhelmingly those most in need, under 50% of the average median income, has shown it can be done. Now the question is, are we content to let this first ever national infrastructure for eviction reduction crumble? Or are we going to build on it and strengthen it and make permanent gains? Do we let the nationwide progress on court diversion, legal representation, tenant protections, and other reforms that the ERA has inspired and funded, do we let them fall by the wayside, or do we see this as a unique and tremendous historic opportunity to build on them and make them lasting? Now, I will say, as coordinator of the American Rescue Plan in a whole lot of emergency pandemic policy areas, our goal is to return to pre-pandemic normal. On eviction prevention, our goal must be to not return to pre-pandemic normal, to not return to policies where evictions are too often a first resort, not a last resort. Our goal cannot be to return to an old normal where 3.6 million tenants get eviction filings each year, often for small hundreds of dollars of back rent, with no legal representation or process for mediation with the landlord. We know we have to move forward and not go back because the cost is too high. We lose the returns that we get to society by avoiding this type of lasting harm. We know that evictions are one of the areas where when people are evicted, it is scarring to the economic dignity of parents, scarring to their future earnings, creates scarring to families and to the future of their children. We cannot go back. We must build and go forward. That is the theme of our summit today, to build on the emergency rental assistance for lasting reform, and where possible, to use remaining American Rescue Plan funds to start or continue this process. Today, we are bringing together 8 models of reform in court-based eviction diversion, right to counsel, partnership with tenant and community-based organizations, early resolution of eviction problems as examples of the type of reform we are committed to and want to see more of across our country. These are initiatives led by state Supreme Court justices, by mayors, by housing groups and tenant groups that work closely, often with amazing legal service colleagues. I'm honored to be joined today by my amazing colleagues that we have worked so closely with: Deputy Secretary Adeyemo, Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta, our leader on housing, overall housing policy at the domestic policy, Eric Pothig, Jacob Liebenluft, the Chief Recovery Officer, and I could go on, but Noel Polio at Treasury, and Tia Patterson at OMB, and Vinay Nayak, and Peggy Bailey, and Emily Benford, and Devin O'Connor, and I could go on, the people who've worked for well over a year, 18 months on this policy. But with that, I want to now turn to our first speaker, Matt Desmond. There are many things one could say about Matt Desmond that are all positive, but I'm going to focus on three. One, his Pulitzer Prize winning book, Evicted, it probably did as much as any single piece of literature ever to raise the centrality of eviction prevention as something anyone who cares about justice and economic dignity should put at the front of their policy agenda. That book did so much to bring the heart of this and the policy issues that needed to be resolved. The second thing I want to say is that often when somebody has a success like that, they decide, well, I need to move on to other pastures. I've already won a Pulitzer Prize in that area, but not Matt Desmond. He instead founded the Princeton Eviction Lab, which is now the singular authoritative source bringing together top scholars from around the country on eviction and eviction prevention policy. Just an enormous help in filling in the gaps of knowledge that we still suffer from. And third, just at a personal administration level, Matt has, whether he meant to or not, been an extremely valuable advisor. There was no one who told us earlier on that when we're attacking this, while we have to do everything we can to get emergency rental assistance moving swiftly, that we have to build reform at the same time, like court diversion, because that would both slow the process and get more people a chance to help, but just as important, that we would be building reform for the future. So it is extremely appropriate that our first speaker today is Matt Desmond. So Matt, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Gene. It's such an honor to be with all of you today. I want to thank Gene for that kind introduction, and more so, I want to thank him for his just tireless and incredible leadership through this trying, dark time that the country has experienced. Today, I want to talk about the impact that emergency rental assistance had on evictions in America, and I brought some receipts. So here we go. Just to kind of set the scene. So recall, before the pandemic, the country was in a deep housing crisis. Evictions were happening all over the country. That's what you see on this map. In urban communities and rural communities, 1 out of 6 metros, eviction rates were actually higher in the suburbs than in the city. This was a deep national problem that the country was facing before COVID entered our shores. African-American families and Hispanic families were disproportionately affected by the eviction crisis. In fact, the eviction rate for African-American renters is almost twice the eviction rate for white renters in this country. And that deeply matters because eviction is incredibly harmful to families and communities. Children often lose, their schools, families lose their homes, their neighborhood. You often lose all your possessions, which are piled on the street or taken by movers. An eviction comes with a legal record, which prevents families from moving into safe housing in a good neighborhood, because many landlords see an eviction as a disqualifying mark against a family. That's why study after study show that families move into worse housing than they lived in before after they get evicted. They move into neighborhoods with high rates of poverty, high rates of crime. There are studies that show that eviction causes job loss. Losing a home is such a stressful, drawn-out event. It can cause families to make mistakes at work, lose their footing in the labor market. And then there's the effect that displacement just has on your health. Eviction has been linked to depression, to suicide. Babies born to mothers who experience an eviction while pregnant are significantly more likely to be born with adverse birth outcomes, which have been linked to lifelong consequences, even multi-generational consequences. And that's before COVID. That's before COVID-19. During COVID-19, eviction often meant exposure. It meant sickness. It often meant death. So when the pandemic struck, advocates rightly raised serious concern that the country was about to experience a historic rise in evictions across the United States. And the federal government responded with bold relief, bold action, specifically two historic policies. The federal eviction moratorium, which was issued in September 2020 and lasted 331 days, and the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which allocated roughly $46.5 billion to struggling tenants. And as you'll see from this graph, the emergency rental assistance payments really started increasing at the end of 2021. This was really important because eviction moratorium expired in August of that year. So by the end of 2021, more households received emergency rental assistance payments than households usually receive eviction filings in the average year. It really started getting out to families across the country. So what difference did it make? So the best way to answer that from an eviction prevention perspective is to look at something we call the eviction tracking system here at the Eviction Lab at Princeton University. So we're able to look at evictions more or less in real time for 6 states and 31 cities, which encompasses 25% of rental homes. And then we kind of take that sample and use statistical models to extrapolate out to make national estimates about where evictions are week to week in America. So here's what evictions look like over the course of 2021. And what you're looking at is eviction filings relative to normal levels, which would be that 100% level right at the top. And you can see evictions remain well below normal levels even after the eviction moratorium expired. Now, this number, this impact is most certainly an underestimate because it reflects the average number of evictions that we would have expected relative to normal years. And of course, COVID was nothing like a normal year. It had a pandemic, it had an eviction, an economic fallout from that. So there were 1.36 million fewer evictions in 2021 than would be expected. And that means lives were saved. A study out of Duke University found that eviction prevention policies like the Emergency Rental Assistance Program lowered the death rate during COVID by 11%. You know, at the end of last year, evictions were down 53% in Albuquerque, 54% in Cleveland, 63% in Memphis. This was completely unheard of. This was tremendous progress. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program had helped cut the eviction filing rate in half in city after city across America, such that even during a recession, evictions were lowest that they had ever been on record. If you extend past last year, what do you see? So what you're looking at here is the amount of eviction filings that were prevented that we didn't see between the end of the CDC moratorium and July of this year. And so every time you see that number fall below zero, that means evictions nationwide were much lower than we would expect. And the bottom line here is between the end of the eviction moratorium and today, over 216,000 evictions, fewer evictions were filed than would be expected in a typical year. And remember, evictions happen to households. So that 216,000 number, that's affecting a lot more people. It likely touched over 500,000 people, spared the pain and violence of eviction because of government intervention. The largest reductions in eviction filings were in places that previously experienced the highest eviction rates, particularly majority Black and low-income communities. In these communities, eviction filing rates were cut in half after the moratorium. Now, this was not only because the Emergency Rental Assistance Program got money into the hands of families that needed it, but also because advocates used ERA funds to reshape how housing court works. Specifically, they developed eviction diversion programs in court after court. And these programs have been shown to be incredibly effective at preventing involuntary moves and making property owners whole. The Philadelphia Eviction Diversion Program has settled 80% of cases without an eviction. The Durham Eviction Diversion Program has resulted in 73% of families remaining housed. Eviction diversion programs that intervene early in the eviction process and mandate diversion as a prerequisite for eviction are the gold standards here. And, in this way, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program did a lot to reshape the way that housing courts around the country work, helping to bring about a more humane and rational adjudication process. So where do things stand today? So in several states, the eviction rate is still far below typical numbers. So in Delaware, evictions are 60% of what they normally are at this time of year. In New Mexico, for example, they're 80% of what they are normally. That said, in other states, we're seeing evictions rise back to normal levels and even exceeding normal levels as ERA and moratorium and other federal supports have ran out. We did something spectacular, and it would be a shame to see our country revert to something back to normal, because normal was completely unacceptable. So let me just conclude with this. My conclusion is very simple. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program made one heck of a difference. That eviction filings have stayed well below normal levels after the moratorium ended speaks to the impact the ERA program had in particular. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program, in combination with the moratorium, formed the most important federal housing policy in the last decade. These combined initiatives were the deepest investment in low-income renting families the federal government has made since the development and invention of public housing in America. This was a real win. It was the most important eviction prevention policy in American history, and I am extremely grateful and frankly proud that the federal government showed up for renting families with such strength during the pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Desmond, for that excellent presentation. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next opening speaker before we go to our discussion of highlighting particular models of reform around the country. Diane Yentel is the leader of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. I'd like to say, again, like with Matt, there are many things to say. I'll say a few. One, I think that the coalition she leads is not only one of the most effective in housing, but I think is one of the most effective and progressive policy that I have seen in all of my many years. Two, while they work on a wide range of housing policies affecting low-income families, I know that Diane and the Low-Income Housing Coalition had a particularly strong and effective impact on the passage of the emergency rental assistance. And I know that because before I entered the government, she was calling me to connect her and help in several different ways. So I saw it firsthand from the outside before I was in the inside. And third, I mentioned during my remarks that we only were able to speed up effectiveness and achieve the types of results Matt Desmond just went through because of a vigorous feedback loop. And look, there's no hiding it. There is always going to be constant tension between advocacy groups and those who face the limitations of governing. But I think what we also saw was how important that feedback loop was, how important it is to listen to each other and to respond to the facts on the ground. And I think there's nothing more I could say about Diane than to say that we listened often, and that many of the policies that helped this program improve came from not just her advocacy, but the tenants and low-income housing groups on the ground who fed in their feedback to us constantly each month and helped us and Treasury Department find better paths forward. So with that, Diane, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jean, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. And thank you for your leadership and your partnership in the work. So starting in March of 2020, the National Low Income Housing Coalition led, together with over 2,000 organizations and many more impacted people from across the country, a national campaign for Rent Relief Now. Together, we called for a national moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent and substantial emergency rental assistance to ensure that renters could stay current on their rent and landlords could continue to maintain and operate their properties. So ultimately, Congress provided $46 billion in emergency rental assistance, an unprecedented level of support for low-income renters. For perspective, it's more than 46 times what the federal government allocated to help renters during the Great Recession. And emergency rental assistance, taken together with the federal eviction moratorium, was the broadest action taken by the federal government to keep low-income renters stably housed in decades. So once Congress provided the resources, the National Low Income Housing Coalition worked very closely with the White House and across the administration, as well as with impacted people, with our state and local partners, with program administrators, to together build a new national infrastructure to get these vital resources to the tenants most in need and keep them stably housed. There was great urgency to this work because we were racing against time to prevent people from losing their homes during a pandemic, as eviction moratoriums were challenged. And emergency rental assistance got off to a slow start. It was slow work to build, staff, and administer major new programs during a global pandemic. It takes time to design effective programs that center and prioritize people with the lowest incomes and people of color. So we tracked and analyzed programs as they got up and running, ultimately tracking over 500 emergency rental assistance programs throughout the country. We researched emergency rental assistance implementation. We identified and amplified best practices. We created and shared tools to improve programs. And through this work, we quickly learned the features of successful ERA programs, those that are able to reach the lowest income and the most marginalized people. Program features like robust and equitable outreach, short, simple applications available in multiple formats and languages, limiting burdensome documentation requirements, using self-attestation for eligibility. So some program administrators included these program features early, others were resistant for a variety of reasons. And as we learned both the best practices and the obstacles to getting ERA to tenants in need, we shared those learnings with the Biden administration, and we made recommendations for actions that the White House could take to improve program performance. And it was very clear throughout the process that the entire Biden administration shared our sense of urgency in preventing evictions, and they were committed to doing the hard work of improving ERA programs with a willingness to make needed real-time course corrections to ensure that this money reached those most in need. So today, despite the slow start, and because of the hard work and partnerships, over 7 million ERA payments have been made, keeping millions of households, predominantly the lowest income people and people of color, stably housed during the pandemic. And this kind of successful alignment of resources to those with the greatest needs doesn't happen by chance, and especially when working so quickly. It happens only with deliberate and purposeful program design and outreach that center equity, as the National Income Housing Coalition, our partners, and the full Biden administration prioritized. ERA was also an accelerant for communities to put new tenant protections in place, protections that will long outlast this current ERA funding. NLHC's partners and allies helped to enact or implement over 150 new state and local tenant protections in 2021 alone. And they are continuing now to work to push state and local officials to use more of their state and local fiscal relief fund dollars for rental assistance and other affordable housing solutions. About $13 billion have been set aside for affordable housing, which is significant, but much more is possible with these funds. And we certainly appreciate the Biden administration's efforts to encourage local communities to do more with these funds. We have much more work to do. There is remaining ERA to get to tenants in need, and there are significant remaining unmet needs. And there will be unless and until Congress funds long-term solutions at the scale necessary, and until communities have robust and permanent tenant protections in place. So we have clear proof of the effectiveness of ERA, and with that comes an opportunity and bipartisan support for making ERA a permanent program. So we have to do so to maintain the infrastructure that communities worked so hard to build and to provide assistance that can help families avoid the long-term harms of eviction. And everybody at the National Income Housing Coalition and our partners across the country look forward to continued partnership with the White House in this work. Thank you, Jean. I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Diane, both for that presentation and your leadership and advocacy, effective advocacy in this area. We are now going to a portion that we found to be very inspiring, which is the degree that we have seen leaders at the judiciary, at the chief judge level for major cities and the chief justice level for entire states take on a leadership role. Again, not just in getting the ERA funds out during this pandemic, but on building reform. And so to open this session, I wanted to turn to our Associate Attorney General, Vanita Gupta. Again, her resume is so filled with so much advocacy for those facing discrimination, barriers due to the color of their skin or their income, economic status. She was under the Obama administration, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. She was during a very difficult time, the leader of the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. And she is now today the 19th Associate Attorney General in our country's history. But for those of us who work on this issue, she will always be the person who wrote the path-breaking first letter to every state, local court around the country in July of 2021, encouraging them to look to court diversion, to eviction diversion, to make evictions a last resort, not a first resort. That letter was path-breaking, and it led to future actions by the Attorney General himself. So Vanita has been just an incredible advocate and supporter of this effort. It's not always that you would see the Justice Department rise into an area like this, and particularly to take a leadership role. But I think there are untold hundreds of thousands of low-income tenant families that are very grateful that she did. So with that, the floor is yours, Madam Associate Attorney General.
Thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Jean. You are far too generous in your leadership and inspiration to make us all do more and do everything that we can to prevent unlawful evictions. Really stands unparalleled. So thank you for your leadership. I am so glad to be here today to highlight the important work that state and local courts are doing to avoid unnecessary evictions. As the Attorney General has said, and as Jean and others before me have said today, addressing the housing situation is an absolutely critical part of reinvigorating communities and a critical part of the Justice Department's renewed commitment to increasing access to justice for every American and to reducing barriers and entrenched disparities in our civil legal systems. That's why, since the beginning of the administration, the department's been spearheading an effort to promote the use of court-based eviction strategies. Eviction diversion, as you've heard, these programs encourage landlords and tenants to resolve disputes without formal litigation. And studies have consistently shown that these programs can significantly increase the likelihood that families can remain in their homes. Last June, as Jean referenced, I sent a letter to state court chief justices and court administrators around the country, highlighting the eviction diversion strategies that have been implemented by state courts in Michigan, Texas, and Pennsylvania. I urged other states to follow these courts' lead and implement eviction diversion strategies in their own jurisdictions. And I encourage courts to build out comprehensive programs that could include access to counsel, which study after study has demonstrated is critical in avoiding evictions. Many courts have taken quite significant action, and some courts, like the Michigan Supreme Court, stayed eviction proceedings to allow litigants to apply for rental assistance. Others actually provided tenants with access to legal counsel, and still others hired mediators to help tenants and landlords achieve a resolution short of litigation. Many of these courts initially acted in response to the pandemic, but now courts around the country are considering how they can take what they've learned about eviction diversion and actually make permanent and lasting transformative change in the way state and local courts handle evictions. Today, I am really grateful to be able to highlight 3 states whose courts are truly leading the way. And I hope that their stories are going to inspire courts around the country to think about how they can implement similar reforms in their jurisdictions. Doing so, there's no question, will help ensure that each and every individual has meaningful and equal access to justice before being evicted from their home. So first, we're going to hear from Chief Justice C. Shannon Bacon of New Mexico. Chief Justice Bacon has served on the New Mexico Supreme Court since 2019 and was sworn in as Chief Justice earlier this year. Through her leadership, New Mexico has brought together landlords and tenants to design a model eviction diversion program that has kept eviction filing rates well below average since the CDC eviction moratorium ended. Chief Justice Bacon, I would love it for you to share with this audience how New Mexico has actually embraced eviction diversion and how it's really changed the way your courts treat eviction cases.
Thank you so much, and thank you for asking me to be here today. So in New Mexico, landlord-tenant relations are governed by statute, the New Mexico Uniform Owner-Resident Relations Act. It's a very summary proceeding by way of writ of restitution and has very specific and short court deadlines. So against that backdrop, we find ourselves in the midst of a pandemic. And as it became apparent that COVID-19 was going to wreak havoc on housing stability in New Mexico, on March the 24th of 2020, the New Mexico Supreme Court issued an order staying eviction proceedings for non-payment of rent. The Supreme Court took action because New Mexico has a part-time legislature that did not go into special session to address housing concerns. So the court needed to take action within the boundaries of the statutory scheme in New Mexico. This was critical because housing is a key determinant of health, and in my opinion, is a fundamental right. Thankfully, as we were going down this path, ARPA money became available to the states to assist with what was becoming an eviction crisis that we're all too familiar with. Along with many other states, there were real challenges in getting the money in the hands of landlords and tenants. Across New Mexico, small programs began to pop up, but nothing was terribly coordinated, and it was largely focused in Albuquerque, which is the largest metropolitan area. So the Supreme Court stepped in. We have the power of convening. That is one of the things that justices can do quite well. And we did this because we recognized collaboration would be key to successful distribution of ERAP funding. The Supreme Court convened a task force comprised of courts, state agencies, I want to give a special acknowledgement to the work of the New Mexico Department of Finance and Administration, brought together property owners, housing advocates, legal service providers, and municipalities. The goal of the task force was to streamline the application process for ERAP monies and coordinate the distribution through the New Mexico judiciary. The result of this amazingly collaborative group was the Supreme Court Eviction Prevention and Diversion Program. Some of the key features of this program that I want to highlight today are that there was a need for a continuation of the Supreme Court's order staying eviction proceedings until the program was operational statewide. And New Mexico's eviction stay was in place longer than any other state in the country. At the outset of an eviction filing, which I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but we have at the outset of the eviction filing, navigators identified who reach out to tenants and to landlords to encourage participation in the program. This is done through phone, email, text messages, and the like. More than 4,000 contacts with individuals subject to eviction proceedings have been contacted by these navigators. Now, because of the strict legislative process in New Mexico, this is an opt-in program. Our legislative scheme has these very strict deadlines, so New Mexico courts cannot legally order landlords to participate in diversion programs, but we give the opportunity for participation, and the navigators are really key to encouraging that participation. If the parties to an eviction proceeding opt in, they have continued assistance from the navigators as well as mediators if necessary. The navigators are key to the success of this program. The navigators work hand in hand with the tenant to apply for the funding and help them navigate what can be a complicated process. The assistance is provided in 4 languages: Spanish, Dene, Vietnamese, and English. Another key feature to the program is that the navigators have real-time access to the program and can provide data and information to the applicant, the landlord, and or the tenant. Gives them real-time information about the status of the application, if materials are missing, or if a payment is on the way. And this real-time access to information through the navigators has really built trust on both landlords and the part of the tenants, because they can see what's happening with the application, and it enables them to be more patient in waiting for the funding to arrive. Another key feature, when a landlord accepts ERAP funding and there is a month-to-month tenancy in place, the tenancy is automatically extended by 3 months. This was to address the very real concern that a landlord would receive ERAP funding and then immediately terminate a month-to-month tenancy. The program rolled out in 4 phases in the first half of this year. The final phase began on July 1st. Not until then did the Supreme Court fully lift its order staying eviction proceedings in New Mexico. The results? Through the work of the New Mexico Department of Finance Administration, the task force, and the judiciary, New Mexico has delivered over $148 million for rent, utilities, emergency housing, and moving costs. This assistance has been provided to over 44,000 households. New Mexico's eviction filing rates have remained at about 64% of historic averages across the state. And in Albuquerque, our largest city, the eviction rates have stayed at 59% of historic averages. We are really proud of this work, but it's just the start. A subgroup of the task force is working on legislative reform to make space within the eviction scheme in New Mexico for programs like the Eviction Prevention and Diversion Program, making that the norm and making participation mandatory. I want to thank everyone on the New Mexico Task Force, and thank you for allowing me to highlight the work of our great state today.
Thank you so much, Chief Justice. There are so many things you talked about that I think are just models for reform. I mean, a task force that brings together tenants and landlords and legal aid attorneys. I will tell you that the need for navigators. When people ask me how I would have reformed the legislation differently, I would have had a set aside just for the type of navigator role, and to see you actually implementing it, and then to see evictions at 64% statewide or 59% at a time people expected them to double or triple is really terrific. So thank you so much for that really detailed description of this, and you know, there's a reason why you and your state were chosen as one of the models we wanted to highlight today. So thank you. I'm next going to introduce another innovator and leader, which is New Orleans Chief Judge Veronica Henry. This leadership, both at the citywide and statewide, from the top judges in those areas or justices, has been is just very inspiring. And again, the type of model that's at the heart of this conference, which is building lasting reform. Chief Judge Veronica Henry is the Chief Judge of the New Orleans Parish First City Court. She was first appointed in 2010. She has developed a very robust eviction diversion program. It actually won the Louisiana State Bar Association's Legal Service Innovation Award, and they are not stopping there and recently moving towards new rights to counsel programs. And we would love to hear more details about, again, your model innovation for the country. So Chief Judge, the floor is yours.
Mr. Sperling, Associate Attorney General Gupta, members of the judiciary, and esteemed guests, good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity. It is my honor to address you today to give you insight into how the implementation of eviction diversion and right to counsel has transformed the eviction process in First and Second City Court in New Orleans. The court's goal with respect to implementation of diversion is to, of course, prevent eviction, to maintain housing stability, and to ensure meaningful access to justice for all litigants. The first ever eviction diversion program in the state of Louisiana, New Orleans First and Second City Court Eviction Diversion Program, is a true partnership between the City of New Orleans's Office of Housing and Community Development, Southeast Louisiana Legal Services, which provides the legal services and other supportive services to tenants. Louisiana Fair Action Housing Center also provides legal services. Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative develops tenant outreach methodologies, and the parochial offices of the courts, which includes the clerks of court, the constables, and other administrative offices. Lastly, of course, all the judges of First and Second City Court play an integral role in keeping the eviction diversion program efficient and effective. Now, New Orleans's First and Second City Court Eviction Diversion Program began in January of 2021, when the court began working with the City of New Orleans to identify tenants at risk of eviction. Thereafter, in February of 2021, the court established an evictions help desk with the assistance of Southeast Louisiana Legal Services. The partnership's approach to eviction diversion is holistic, and I emphasize partnership again because this is most assuredly a team effort, is to identify tenants at risk before a court hearing, identify what the tenant needs, whether it be rental assistance, utility assistance, legal services, social services, or job services, and to make sure landlords are aware of the availability of rental assistance. Now, legal services employs a hands-on approach in the community in that it delivers its services where tenants and landlords live, by establishing satellite offices outside of its downtown location. And they are utilizing advertising, billboards, social media, texting, and postcards. Legal services is at every eviction hearing, A City of New Orleans representative is at every eviction hearing, accepting applications for emergency rental assistance and providing updates on submitted applications. The City of New Orleans has been exceptional and successful in establishing its emergency rental assistance program, and it has been efficient in distributing the emergency rental assistance funds. With the Treasury's allocation of ERAP 1 and 2 funding, the City of New Orleans has received 27,582 applications from the inception of the program. To date, it has served 17,000 landlords and tenants, with an additional 5,000 landlords and tenants anticipated to be served. In May of 2022, the New Orleans City Council built on the eviction diversion program by adopting a new right to counsel ordinance for tenants facing evictions in 2022, and initially funded the program with $2 million in emergency rental assistance funds. Now, Southeast Louisiana Legal Services, their outcomes have been stellar. From February 2021 through June of 2022, the First and Second City Courts Eviction Help Desk and Right to Counsel program have obtained favorable results in 97% of extended eviction cases. Now, this includes dismissals of evictions, consent judgments, providing more time to move, stipulated repayment arrangements, and other results to help stabilize the tenants. To date, Legal Services has served 5,705 individuals, including tenants and their children, with 84% of the households served identified as African American, and 72% of households are headed by women. In June of this year, June of 2022, eviction filings were 10% below the average filing rate in a pre-pandemic year, and default eviction judgments dropped by nearly 20% from the 2019 rates. The New Orleans First and Second City Courts Eviction Diversion Program is and has produced positive outcomes for the court and the entire community. But certainly there's more work to be done. We can always build it better for the years to come. I thank the White House for giving me this opportunity to shine a light on eviction diversion in New Orleans with First and Second City Court, and for this administration's continued commitment all of you have demonstrated in service to the underserved in our community. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Chief Judge. We kept hearing about the great work you were doing. And again, when we wanted to pull together 8 models from around the country of people fighting for lasting reform, you were really at the top of the list. I know you've got other great chief judges around, but I'm glad we were able to put a focus on what you're doing, and greatly appreciate it. So thank you.
Thank you.
I now am going to announce Judge Tom Boyd of the Michigan State Court Administration. I have to say that when we first did the first White House Summit on eviction diversion that we did together with Erica Pothig, one of the first people we looked to was the Michigan Supreme Court Chief Justice McCormick. She was one of the most out front leaders on court diversion, both in Michigan and in pushing nationwide. And she has never stopped pushing for more lasting reform. Indeed, she was the first person that was invited to speak at this conference based on our dialogue about the work they were doing. Very sadly, she has had a sudden family emergency, which is about the only thing that would have probably taken her away from being with us today. But I think everybody here would understand. But she also let us know that Judge Tom Boyd was simply the best person to take her place. He has served, Tom has served as the Michigan State's Court Administrator since 2020, has worked hand in hand with the Chief Justice on the reforms that we are going to discuss. And so, Tom, I know that those are tough shoes to fill, but we're really grateful that you are able to fill in and tell us about the really far-reaching reforms that are being led in Michigan from the Michigan Supreme Court. So with that, Judge Boyd, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sperling and Associate Attorney General Gupta for the generous introduction and for allowing me to participate today. In Michigan, we've had isolated eviction diversion programs for more than a decade. In 2020, the eviction diversion programs were catapulted statewide through action of the Michigan Supreme Court. The question today is what not? As you've just heard, we know that the pandemic-related changes work. In Michigan, our eviction rate was cut in half. Legal representation for tenants increased from 5% to roughly 90%. 98% of households represented by legal aid lawyers remained in their homes. The Michigan Diversion Program collectively approved applications from 150,000 households and delivered $830 million in ERA to struggling tenants and landlords. Federal funds are critical, but we also need continuation of successful processes and partnerships. Processes like assuring tenants know their rights through a mandatory pretrial in most cases, providing meaningful access to legal services and available rental assistance, and whenever appropriate, allowing for a stay in proceedings to have time for the social safety net to step in and provide win-win results for landlords and tenants. Michigan's pandemic response also created and cemented valuable partnerships, including relationships between the courts and the state agencies involved and the NGO social safety net organizations. Each Michigan community has a district court which handles landlord-tenant matters and a HARA, that is a Housing Assessment and Resource Agency. Our pandemic response began with judges asking, what's a HARA? And with the HARAs asking for the names and contact information of local courts. Nothing is more than fundamental with the social safety net knowing where homelessness begins, the district court. These relationships must persist. In this work, listening to the data and feedback is crucial. Our data strongly suggests that continuation of many of the pandemic processes and partnerships is appropriate. And you can't have this conversation without acknowledging the incredible hard work and insight from the men and women of the Michigan District Courts, the lawyers and litigants coming before those courts, legal services in Michigan, and the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, each of whom helped guide us through this process. Their feedback was invaluable and continues to be so. Finally, Chief Justice McCormick is now proposing the transition to statewide diversion for the future. The pandemic orders will remain in place as the public has an opportunity to comment on the longer-term approach. Eviction diversion is here to stay in Michigan. Thank you very much for this opportunity to highlight the work of the Michigan Supreme Court and the Michigan eviction diversion programs.
Thank you so much, Judge Boyd. We really appreciate it. And really, I think we all look forward to hearing more about the progress on this statewide vision and implementation. And we appreciate you filling in at the last minute, greatly appreciated. So with that, we now want to turn to a program where we looked to beyond court-led to look at 5 innovations around the country that we thought were particularly important models for the type of lasting reform we want to see done, including with existing remaining American Rescue Plan resources. To kick off this panel, I'm going to turn to one of my really great partners in the implementation of the American Rescue Plan, which is Jacob Liebenluft, who is the Chief Recovery Officer in the Office of Recovery Programs for Treasury Department, which, as you know, shouldered the largest burden of any department, including not only the emergency rental assistance, but the state and local fiscal recovery plan, the homeowner and assistance fund, the state small business credit initiative, the capital projects. I could go on, but I think Jacob would agree with you that there was probably nothing that was as important to us as the work that was done again with his excellent team, Pascal Noel and Vinay and so many other people still to help speed up, do the corrections. Diane and others, talked about the course corrections that made a significant difference. And so, Jacob, we're going to turn to you to lead this session. Thank you very much. Jacob?
Well, thank you, Gene, for the kind introduction and for the partnership and leadership that you and your team have shown and really all the work that we've done together in implementing rental assistance. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to introduce our next panel on innovations in state and local eviction prevention. We are proud at the Treasury Department to have seen the role that the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and other American Rescue Plan funds that we administer have played in helping to reshape our nation's eviction prevention infrastructure. In designing the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, Treasury recognized that robust and innovative housing stability services were necessary to meet the scale and scope of the challenge that we faced. And so to maximize the uptake of funds and the impact of these important initiatives, we took several steps. First, we wrote program guidance to provide broad latitude for states, territories, localities, and tribal governments to pioneer innovative approaches to build a new nationwide eviction prevention infrastructure. Second, we strongly encourage grantees to dedicate ERA funds, along with state and local fiscal recovery funds, towards eviction prevention initiatives. Just last week, we released guidance that unlocks additional ERA 2 funds for housing stability services that serve very low-income households. And finally, we've worked to share promising practices and provide opportunities for collaboration so that the great work being done across the country can be replicated as part of a lasting infrastructure. We know that when it comes to spreading new and innovative approaches, there is no substitute for seeing what is working in the field. With that in mind, I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to introduce 5 leaders from across the country who have taken steps in their communities to build a new and lasting eviction prevention infrastructure. First, it is my pleasure to pass the Zoom microphone to Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who will explain how Chicago has dedicated $8 million in ERA housing stability funds to adopt an innovative 3-year right to counsel pilot in collaboration with a range of legal service providers. The results have been extraordinary. In the first 6 months after the end of the local eviction moratorium, just 10% of eviction filings resulted in a judgment to remove the tenant, compared to 25% in the equivalent period before the pandemic. Now I'll pass it to Mayor Lightfoot to provide more details on these inspiring efforts.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and thank you, Gene and the whole White House team. It's an honor to be with you today and to talk about the work that we've done in my city of Chicago. I'm grateful that the White House has convened this summit as we chart our path forward and ensure long-term eviction reform. This is a necessary step to providing millions of Americans with housing security and creating, frankly, a much more just and humane society. In my city, throughout the pandemic, our residents, especially our most vulnerable ones, have faced unimaginable loss that has been compounded by systemic poverty and a lack of access to safe and affordable housing. And while we've taken a number of steps to stem that tide, early on in the pandemic, the fear of an eviction tsunami really started to grow. But we were fortunate in Chicago that we had a history of bringing stakeholders together and working collaboratively to mitigate the effects of eviction from various levels of government, state, county, and local, the courts, legal assistance, advocates, tenants, and of course, landlords were a part of the equation. So we got that group back together early on in 2020 and really began to prepare for what life would be like from when the various eviction moratoriums were lifted. And I will just say that the Emergency Rental Assistance Program has been an incredible lifeline to our residents. Let me share with you some details. We were able to relieve residents from the fear of losing their housing and being thrown into further uncertainty and socioeconomic instability. I'm proud to say that in the city of Chicago, led by our great housing commissioner, Marissa Navarro, and her team, the city of Chicago has awarded $150 million to over 19,000 households through our ERA programs. We place an emphasis on equity and use data-driven strategy to make sure that we were reaching those most in need. And as a result of that concentrated, intentional effort and emphasis on equity, we've seen that the ERA money has gone to 60% of our Black residents and 20% of our Latino residents, and has touched almost every one of our 77 neighborhoods in Chicago. In this process, we realized the need to provide future protections well into the future. And that's why we have jump-started innovative new programs to provide our residents with the financial and legal resources that they need to thrive long after the pandemic fades into the recesses of history. To that end, for example, we launched a 3-year right to counsel pilot program in July of 2022, using $8 million in ERA2 housing stability funds that will double the number of tenants facing eviction who now have legal representation, which is critically important, as we all know. This program is expected to serve 2,000 to 3,000 tenants each year, as well as low-income landlords. We also expanded the city and county court-based early resolution program that diverted eviction cases to mediation and provided ERA assistance in partnership with Cook County and the Chicago Bar Foundation. As of last month, this program facilitated $9 million in ERA awards for those court-based programs, supporting over 1,000 households in the city of Chicago. The court-based ERA program will continue through 2024, and if we are provided with reallocated funds, that's a strong hint to our friends at the White House. We anticipate continuing the program through 2025. The city also led an effort to seal pandemic-era eviction filing records, preventing the scarlet letter E of eviction that resulted in tenants' downward moves and long-term hardships. And this is in direct response to feedback that we received from the various convening that we conducted in preparation for what we feared was an eviction tsunami. I'm proud to say that in the first 6 months after the end of the eviction moratorium in October of 2021, just 10% of eviction filings resulted in a judgment to remove the tenant compared to 25% equivalent in the pre-pandemic time period. That represents a reduction of more than 2,000 eviction judgments. And when you consider that the city of Chicago accounts for roughly over half of the eviction filings in the state of Illinois, that change is a very big and consequential deal for our residents. So suffice it to say, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program and our subsequent innovative programming on top of that, under this banner, made a real impact and continues to on the lives of our residents who need it most, and moved us ever closer to our vision of having a fairer and more equitable city. I look forward to the continuation of these programs in Chicago and others like it across the country. And I am inspired by the conversations that I've heard so far. Thanks so much to the various chief judges and court officers who are on the front lines of this work. And thanks to my colleagues across the country who understand that housing is a basic and fundamental right. And we must do everything that we can to give people the opportunity, not only to stay in their homes, but to remove the psychological burden that a fear of eviction brings and all the cascading effects that come with it. Thanks so much. And thanks again for convening of this important conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Mayor Lightfoot. We appreciate hearing about the impact that these programs have had, and it's especially, I think, valuable for the model that it can provide to other jurisdictions. I'm going to turn it next to our second speaker, Andrea Bell of Oregon Housing and Community Services, who will explain how Oregon was one of the first states to supplement ERA funds with state and local fiscal recovery funds and additional state funding, among other innovative initiatives from the state. Treasury has strongly encouraged others to follow this example and build on the infrastructure of ERA, given the need for long-term resources geared towards eviction prevention. With that, I'll pass it on to Andrea.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Jean. And first off, I want to just underscore our appreciation to the Biden-Harris administration for acting with urgency on ensuring both the provision of emergency rental assistance resources during what felt like perilous times for many renters across the country, but also for translating the commitments to the American people through action. I am eager to be here with all of you today. So just to step back for a moment and to give the Oregon landscape, Oregon received over $383 million in federal support to provide emergency rent assistance and to help prevent evictions across the state. We were fortunate in that the Oregon State Legislature and our Governor Kate Brown, also stepped up by investing an additional $100 million of American Rescue Plan funds in towards rental assistance towards the ongoing need of our communities. Now, from small towns and rural communities to urban and suburban communities, Oregon Housing and Community Services has distributed emergency rental assistance to 60,829 individuals and families. And we've heard it today, but it's worth uplifting that when we stabilize individuals and families, there is not only a benefit to the community, there's an economic benefit that is often felt from a generational perspective. Now, through our work within the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, we were able to both monitor and track data to help us better understand which of our residents across the state were able to access these resources and who were not, to help us make both real-time and data-driven decisions based on our values of racial justice and making sure that these resources are reaching far and wide across the state of Oregon. We decided to implement a prioritization schema and framework to reach those highest in need. This was not a first come, first program intentionally. We wanted to make sure that those households with the lowest incomes, those most in need, as presented in the data earlier, are often Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, were able to access these resources. 85% of households served were below 50% area median income. That's over 52,000 households that were at 50% or less median income. Now, as a state agency, as a government agency, it is important for us to acknowledge and uplift that this has been a galvanization across the state, across the country, of both state and local partnerships, particularly with our community-based organizations. Now, much like all of you here in Oregon, we will not accept gaps in our eviction prevention system. as facts of life. We know that the people that we serve deserve better, and so we will continue to do better and to transform our system in alignment with our commitments to the people that we serve. Now, the Oregon State Legislature allocated an additional $100 million in state general funding to serve as a bridge or an off-ramp from the influx of rental assistance, knowing that these critical resources are time limited in nature. And any positive steps, any successes that we are able to achieve are only made possible because of the relationships, the expertise, and the trust building of community-based organizations. So we had partners like Unite Oregon, BNSR, the Springfield Eugene Tenants Association, in communities, door knocking, engaging with neighbors around eviction filing resources and to help them stay stably housed. Oregon Housing and Community Services also invested in building up the capacity of our culturally responsive and specific organizations, such as the Urban League of Portland, the Oregon Worker Relief Coalition, and the Immigrant and Refugee Community Organization. And also it's important to uplift our Oregon Law Center, who launched the Eviction Defense Project to provide critical services to the people of Oregon who received eviction notices, also monitor court dockets across the state to do direct outreach to tenants, and also implemented an eviction prevention response program. So we're talking resources that are out the door and to renters, oftentimes in the courtroom. So talking about not only meeting the need, but meeting that need in the moment where people are at and facing that heartbreak, potential heartbreak of eviction. And then we also worked with our community action agency partners across the state to really stand up and deliver the Oregon Eviction Diversion and Prevention Assistance Program, and then also working to provide resources specific to the unique housing needs of our domestic violence and sexual assault survivors, recognizing that those targeted interventions are key. And so as we think about future forward here today, I would just impress upon us a couple of things, which is that it emboldens us to continue center racial justice and uplifting the expertise of lived experience, and knowing that more is needed. The tools that we have relied on in the past may not be enough. We have to continue to pursue and transform our system. And certainly we here in Oregon are eager to continue that pursuit and working with all of our partners in the White House and across the nation as well. So we appreciate being with you today.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing all the work that you're doing in Oregon. Our next speaker will be Hazel Remish of the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. The city of Cleveland was among the first cities in the United States to legislatively adopt right to counsel. This program was initially funded using pre-pandemic funds and through a public-private partnership, but it has since grown using ERA and other American Rescue Plan funds into a model for the nation, while saving the city millions per year in government services because of the impact of avoided evictions. I'll now pass it to Hazel, who will describe how these and other innovations have helped prevent eviction judgments in Cleveland.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Jean, and to the White House for the opportunity to be here today. It's an honor. Just to level set to what Jacob just mentioned, in 2019, the city of Cleveland was among the first cities in the United States to legislate a right to counsel, and only the first in the Midwest, which provides legal representation for tenants facing eviction who are low income at 100% of the federal poverty guidelines and who have a child in the household. This program is initially funded through a public-private partnership, but as private funds begin to sunset, Cleveland has allocated emergency rental assistance and is looking to allocate American Rescue Plan funds to continue to sustain the program. Right to Counsel in Cleveland is a partnership with United Way of Greater Cleveland, and it became effective July 2020, a critical time for our communities as we were in the early stages of the pandemic. We had an independent evaluation completed for the first year and a half of the program, and we are beyond proof of concept. The data shows that because of right to counsel, legal aid clients prevented eviction or an involuntary move in 93% of the cases where that was the tenant's goal. 93% of the cases, we were able to avoid eviction and prevent an involuntary move. This is incredibly important because right to counsel is responsive to an eviction crisis that disproportionately impacts Black and female-headed households in Cleveland. And eviction filings in Cleveland have remained historically low, even after the expiration of the CDC order halting evictions. It's a combination of rental assistance and legal assistance together that promote housing stability. And because of right to counsel, 83% of tenants were able to leverage rent assistance who had that goal. When we moved into the space of right to counsel, we really tried to be very tenant focused and client focused, looking at what is the goal of the client. And so we're looking at both of these metrics as a proven intervention that truly stabilize households. In addition, legal representation has increased in Cleveland from 1% to about 20%, and we continue to focus on raising the number of tenants who access legal services by focusing on targeted community outreach to reach communities where there are high eviction filings but low legal representation or low tenant engagement. Civil legal aid can help tenants avoid the negative outcomes of eviction, such as homelessness, stress, adverse health outcomes, disruption in education, and the trauma, as we have heard today. But investments in civil justice efforts have proven great return on public investment over time. For example, the total preliminary fiscal impact of Cleveland's right to counsel for 2021 was approximately $4.3 million to $4.7 million. That fiscal impact is directly related to healthcare savings, avoided foster care placements, and social safety net expenses, and a preservation of residency in the city of Cleveland. I thank you for the opportunity today, and we have an opportunity to continue to build and sustain eviction system reforms with the expansion and continued support of right to counsel, so that when someone is facing housing instability and their loss of their most basic human need, their housing, they don't have to face it alone. Thank you, Jacob. I'll hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Hazel, for describing the work you're doing in Cleveland, which really I think is reflective of the work that legal aid is doing across the country. I'm going to turn it to our fourth speaker now, Zach Newman of the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project in Colorado. He'll speak about the Colorado Stability Fund, a unique revolving rental assistance fund capable of issuing quick, accurate ERA payments in less than 24 hours, and a model of the kind of innovative program that's been made possible with the American Rescue Plan funds. Let me turn it to you, Zach.
Thanks, Jacob. And it's an honor to be here with people who've worked so hard to find innovative solutions to America's eviction crisis. Our work began in 2020 as a community organizing project. Back then, we provided direct legal services to renters who are at risk of losing their homes. In those early days, with limited resources and few defenses available under state law, it often felt like our job was to deliver bad news to our clients. That changed in 2021 when emergency rental assistance became widely available. Working with our clients and our community, we built a program that integrates all of the services a renter may need when facing eviction, accessible from a single point of contact. When clients call us or come to one of our clinics, they're connected to someone who can help them complete their rental assistance application, legal representation for situations where rental assistance is not enough, and when everything else fails, help finding a new place to live. At the core of this model is the Colorado Stability Fund, formed by my co-founder, Sam Gilman. The Stability Fund exists to get people rental assistance in less time than it'll take the court to complete their eviction, sometimes processing checks in less than 24 hours before hand delivering them to a courthouse or to a landlord. The Colorado Stability Fund was formed through a unique partnership between our organization, the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority, and the Division of Housing within Colorado's Department of Local Affairs. In early 2021, the Colorado Housing and Finance Authority provided our organization with a no-interest, multi-million-dollar line of credit that we use to make urgent payments to renters. We issue payments against this line of credit at risk to our balance sheet, and then submit them to the Division of Housing for reimbursement under emergency rental assistance contracts. By combining legal representation and supportive services with fast-moving rental assistance, we've reduced paperwork and confusion for clients and given them more power when they're negotiating to keep their homes. To date, our organization has served over 20,000 people and paid out over $50 million in rental assistance. We're also applying our model to address other economic security issues under a broader banner. the Community Economic Defense Project. Alongside eviction prevention, we're implementing a foreclosure prevention program in conjunction with Treasury's Homeownership Assistance Fund, and have launched programs related to medical and housing debt and residential predatory towing. America's historic investment in emergency rental assistance provided a new blueprint for stabilizing families on the brink of losing their homes. Time and again, we've seen the combination of same-day financial assistance and legal services stabilize households, sometimes even on courthouse steps. As Colorado draws down remaining emergency rental assistance funds into early 2023, our team is committed to working with state and local partners to build and fund permanent, sustainable eviction diversion initiatives. We can't go back to the pre-pandemic normal. These programs play a critical role in keeping our clients in their homes, and we're working really hard to preserve them.
Thank you so much, Zach, and thank you for your work, which has been a model for us at Treasury as we've looked to implement our funds. Finally, we're going to hear now from Philadelphia Council member Helen Gim, who championed the nation's first mandated pre-filing eviction diversion ordinance. This is an example of a broader set of eviction diversion programs that aim to make eviction litigation a last resort, not a first resort. And as you'll hear, this diversion program, in combination with emergency rental assistance, has led to significant increases in housing stability, with more than 4 in 5 cases resulting in settlement or agreement to continue negotiation. I'll now pass it to you, Councilmember Gim.
Thank you so much, Jacob, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Philadelphia City Council member Helen Gim, and I'm so incredibly honored to join today's important gathering on how cities like mine have made historic advances to build one of the most successful eviction prevention programs in the nation, thanks to the funding provided by the American Rescue Plan. I'm here to share how one of the highest evicting cities reduced evictions by over 2/3 and built a collaborative network among city agencies, housing advocates, and our municipal court system that has been a model of hope and action in dire times. It's my hope that we leave this summit today inspired to do more at the federal level, to invest more, and to prove that the American Rescue Plan was more than just an emergency bailout. It's actually a path towards economic stability and growth. I come to this work as a longtime community organizer in Philadelphia, which is the poorest large city in the country. 37% of our children live in poverty. 1 in 4 residents live in poverty. For so many vulnerable families, a sudden eviction is a common experience. Evictions are traumatic. It means children are pulled from their schools. Single moms can lose their families, and veterans, seniors, and disabled Philadelphians are forced out onto the streets to hunt for housing. When I first came into office, Philadelphia was the 4th highest evicting city in the country, processing more than 20,000 eviction filings every single year. 74% involved a Black tenant, 70% involved women, and over half targeted parents and caregivers. Poverty on this scale does not happen by accident. Everything about our system was geared toward an eviction. When 80% of landlords have an attorney, but just 11% of tenants can afford one, the system is wrong. When courts allow unlicensed landlords to file for an eviction, the system is wrong. When more resources are geared towards removing people from their homes than figuring out solutions to keep them housed, the system is wrong. When the pandemic hit in March 2020, we were already engaged in a citywide anti-eviction effort. A movement of legal and housing advocates put a human face on the untold cost of evictions. And together we were able to win victories such as a tenant legal defense fund, a right to counsel law, and new court measures to stop those unlicensed landlords from filing for an eviction. Once the stay-at-home orders went into effect, though, it was very clear that we had to act more boldly than ever. We launched a small local rent assistance program with emergency funding, instituted a very temporary eviction moratorium, and then I led an eviction prevention legislative package through our council body, the centerpiece of which was a mandatory pre-filing eviction diversion law. The American Rescue Plan funding was critical to the success and viability of the program. Knowing that there were federal funds to resolve debts and guarantee rent assured landlords that this program was as much in their interests as it was in a tenant's. Thus far, the American Rescue Plan has delivered over $250 million to our city and kept over 42,000 households with a roof over their heads. Having this level of funding meant we could institute that creative and bold eviction diversion program that we had long talked about. Our eviction diversion law requires landlords and tenants to file for rent assistance and seek housing counseling support at least 30 days before an eviction can even be filed. We now provide financial counseling for tenants and train mediators and housing counselors for diversionary hearings. We have housing counselors and community-based organizations all across the city, concentrated in neighborhoods that too often see disproportionately high rates of eviction. And this process has received praise from both landlords and tenants alike. To date, this process has an 85% success rate of avoiding evictions. Court wait times have been reduced from 90 days to 30 days. And most dramatically, from more than 20,000 evictions pre-pandemic, Philadelphia saw about 6,800 evictions in 2021 and far less the year before, a drop of more than 2/3. We're not slowing down. The law guaranteeing a right to counsel for low-income tenants launched last year, and just this past June, our city council allocated $30 million toward a local rental assistance fund targeted specifically for eviction diversion. And thanks again to federal government guidelines, Philadelphia is receiving another $12 million in federal rent assistance money that will help thousands of households on an assistance wait list. And to ensure the economic hardship of the pandemic does not follow families into the future, our council body introduced and passed the Renters Access Act, which restricts the use of eviction records and applications and provides tenants the right to clear information and the ability to dispute information used to often deny a rental application. As has already been said before, today's convening shows the power of what it means to catalyze collaboration and transformation among federal, state, and local agencies to end harmful, racist, and dysfunctional systems of oppression. As policymakers in a time of crisis, we have an extraordinary responsibility to make the aspirational become pragmatic. And we have a duty to families everywhere to make sure that these protections are permanent. Thanks to the Biden-Harris administration's American Rescue Plan funding, that's exactly what we've been able to do in Philadelphia. Thank you, everybody who's been on this call, for your incredible inspiration and for a community of housing advocates who are proving that seismic change can happen.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Gim, and thank you to all of our panelists for providing inspiring examples of what our American Rescue Plan programs have made possible in partnership with state and local grantees, as well as advocates across the country, and showing what we can work together to build going forward. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Jean.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you to Andrea Bell, Mayor Lightfoot. Thank you so much for being on. Hazel Remish, Zach Newman, Helen Jim, showing us really how they are among the local heroes from Chicago to Oregon to Cleveland to Denver to Philadelphia and throughout the country who are making this reform happen. And you're really what this entire summit is about and what we want the future of not going back to a pre-pandemic normal to look like. With that, I want to now introduce Wally Adeyemo, who is the Deputy Secretary of Treasury, who has enormous amount of responsibilities, but the one that has been most important to me is that the Secretary of Treasury put Wally in charge of all of the American Recovery Plan programs, including the very important child tax credit and other provisions. He's been a partner in so many, along with Jacob. They've been two great partners in all of the implementation. But I do want to say that what is really I've appreciated so much, and you see constantly from the Deputy Secretary, is a constant push on housing and equity, whether it's supply of housing, eviction prevention, and the equitable distribution of those funds. And again, he worked through with us and helped lead at Treasury. A lot of the course corrections that you heard have made a significant difference. And so I'm really honored and pleased to introduce the Deputy Secretary of Treasury.
Well, Gene, let me just say thank you for your leadership, frankly, and for helping to get us to this point, not only when it comes to emergency rental assistance, but across the programs of the American Rescue Plan. You've been a great quarterback to the things we've done here at Treasury, but across the government. And it's been great getting a chance to hear from local leaders about the work that they've done to make sure that they have addressed what was truly a crisis when we came into office of evictions in this country, knowing that people were losing their home due to no fault of their own. And because of the work of people like Senator Brown and Congress, we had the resources to make sure that we could help alleviate some part of this eviction crisis. But the truth is, like so many things in government, execution matters. And here at Treasury, we care deeply about making sure that we executed these programs in light of the direction given by Congress and working closely with our partners in the states and in organizations, not because we theoretically cared about this, but because it was personal to us. I remember early on during the crisis, sitting down with a number of Americans who had lost their apartments, their homes, because of evictions that had happened during the crisis. And they reminded me of my neighbors, many of whom lost their houses during the financial crisis that happened a decade before in the Inland Empire. And it was those personal stories, it was the lived experiences of people that we knew and that we saw that led to us thinking about these programs differently. Ultimately, what we did at Treasury, working closely with state officials, was we listened. We listened to advocates, we listened to people who were going through evictions, and where they said that the paperwork was too complicated and made it hard for people who were already experiencing COVID and dealing with a loss of finances, we simplified the paperwork. And we put out guidance to make sure that states and local governments could do so as well. And because of the efforts that we undertook, we saw real results. In 2021, for example, 80% of funding from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program reached very low income households. 40% of the funding went to applicants who primarily identified as Black, and 20% went to those that identified as Latino. The Princeton University Eviction Lab found that millions of renters avoided the threat of eviction last year. And largely that was driven by the work that we did using emergency rental assistance money and the efforts of advocates and city and state governments around the country. And the thing that we have to remember is that this outcome was not an accident. It happened because of government policy working in collaboration and coordination with people on the ground. And it is critical that we keep up our efforts to make sure that we don't, that we ensure that going forward, the number of evictions in our country is far lower than they were before. And this isn't only an urban problem. We all know that also something that affects Americans in rural communities. And we've seen efforts in rural communities as well to address these challenges in meaningful ways. For example, in North Dakota and in Wyoming, where they've taken a hands-on approach to making sure that mom and pop operators of apartments have access to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. I was in Memphis just a few months ago, and I saw how that community is coming together with their schools and universities to make sure that legal representation is offered to people who often show up for eviction hearings without that representation. All of this has been made possible by funding that was provided by Congress. I think one of the things that I'd like to do is to make sure that we recall that government policy has the ability to change people's lives as long as we implement it well. And that's exactly what we've done here, is taken the resources provided by Congress and work closely with people on the ground, people who can go that last mile, and listen to them in order to make sure that we implement these programs well. And because of that, we're in a place where today the emergency rental assistance funding is almost gone, but it's critical that we think about what we do going forward. And I want to remind local officials that because of senators like Senator Brown, we have the ability to use some of the CRA money to help create more long-term opportunity. One, in terms of investing in administration so that we have programs that are going on long after the RA money is gone. And number two, using some of the money to invest in affordable housing, which is critically important. What I want to say today is that we've already seen that of the money that Congress has allocated as part of the American Rescue Plan, we've already seen $12.9 billion dedicated to helping to meet these housing needs. And our hope is that going forward, we'll see even more of that money go towards affordable housing. But the truth is that the only way that we solve challenges like evictions in our country, or the fact that too many of our children go to sleep hungry in our country, is by working together in partnership with local governments and with advocates throughout the country. And that's what we're committed to doing at Treasury, using the American Rescue Plan money and using the other resources that Congress has provided to us. And it's something that we've done in partnership with our allies and partners in the White House. And again, I want to thank everyone who's been involved in this effort of addressing the eviction crisis that was caused by COVID-19, but everyone who's also committed to the idea that we want to ensure that we continue to address evictions going forward using all the tools in our toolkit. So thank you so much for allowing me to join this conversation, and I'll hand it back over.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deputy Secretary. Greatly appreciate it. Your leadership on this and continued focus on lasting reform. I will say that we've heard today from many of us who many who have advocated for this legislation, many who have been involved in the implementation, both at the national level and the state and local level. But I think we all do so under the knowledge that none of this happens without the right congressional leadership. And I just can't tell you how much all of us owe a debt of gratitude to many members of Congress and people like Denny Heck, who were involved at the beginning, but so much to the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, Sherrod Brown, and his counterpart, the chairwoman, Maxine Waters. Without their leadership, we would not have had the chance to implement with the type of reform and innovation that so many of you have shown. Senator Brown has seen a lot of the things he has championed taking place now, perhaps the top leader on the commitment to innovate, locate, and create manufacturing jobs in the United States. So much of his work is taking place in many of these high-level legislation that is has just passed and hopefully on the verge of passing now. But Mr. Chairman, what you did to help ensure that there was an emergency rental assistance, that we can now talk about going to 7 million at-risk renters and their families, that we can now talk about a vision of not going back to an old, very bad normal and to a new, more humane and just normal. None of that happens without your leadership and the leadership of Chairwoman Waters. And so we saved the best for last and are just honored that you will join us here. So with that, Senator Brown, the floor is yours.
Gene, thank you so much. And the best for last would have been me speaking before Wally Adeyemo, but thank you for that. And it was a pleasure to get to hear Zach Newman and Councilwoman Guy from Philadelphia. I can see what an important leader you are in that great city. And I had the pleasure also when I got on, I was listening to Hazel Remish with Cleveland Legal Aid. And Hazel, Ohio has some of the best legal aid services in the country. And the advocates for basic legal equality out of Toledo and Columbus, I'm biased. My daughter worked there for many years. The work Hazel does, the Legal Aid Society in Cleveland, all of that matters so much. And Gene Sperling, your leadership on this just meant so much to this country to implement the emergency rental assistance. And we saw the importance of that today in our committee. Diane Yentel, who's testified in our committee today. No one's been a stronger voice for people suffering from homelessness and housing instability than Diane Yantel has been. She testified today. So did Matt Desmond. His work has done so much to illustrate the causes and consequences of the eviction crisis. They were both testifying to the Senate Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. This committee used to just be called colloquially around the Senate Banking Committee. Come February, when the Democrats took the majority with a new president, the most pro-worker president, and Gene knows, I think this, and Wally knows it, that most pro-worker president in my lifetime. That committee, instead of just being called the Senate Banking Committee, we always refer to the committee's work on housing and public transit. We've done probably 7 or 8 hearings on housing, and it's going to be more than that in the future. And with that will come more action. But back to Matt Desmond for a moment. When he signs his book Evicted, he writes in his cover, "Home equals life." That idea informs so much of the work we do on this committee. It's what Professor Desmond and Ms. Vientel were testifying today before our committee about. You all know America faced a housing crisis long before this pandemic. A quarter of renters pay half their income for housing. You know what that means. One thing goes wrong in their lives. Their car breaks down, they lose their job, someone gets sick. They can't afford rent because the rent eats first. It's a big reason why millions of Americans faced the threat of eviction each year. Nearly 600,000 people experienced homeless on any single night in January of 2020. That's why when COVID-19 hit, we launched this unprecedented effort to prevent evictions in the midst of a pandemic. And Gene's flattering words about my work really starts with the committee staff that Laura and Beth and Alicia and Megan and so many others in our committee have done to make this a reality, so that all of you can then, in the White House and in the executive branch, can administer this aid and make sure it matters in people's lives. Because we know what evictions do to people's lives. They turn them upside down. They make it harder to find safe, stable housing again. We know what it does to their children and their school districts and in the disruptions in their classrooms and all that. In a pandemic where your ability to shelter safely in place could make the difference between life and death, the stakes a couple of years ago or a year ago were that much higher. We work with my counterpart, Chair Waters, in the House. I can't say enough good things about Maxine Waters. We worked with the Biden administration. We worked with advocates across the country to put $46 billion, that's $46,000 million in emergency rental assistance. We know it was a challenge for states and communities to stand up this unprecedented nationwide effort to prevent evictions. We know there were times it took a while to get people the help that they need. We also know that the emergency rental assistance has worked to keep millions of families in their homes. States and communities have already made over 6 million rent and utility payments to help families pay the rent, to keep the lights on, to help landlords pay their own bills, because we think about them too in this, especially the small landlords. Communities across the country use these funds to provide housing stability services, to get families the help they need. They work with community organizations and the courts to build new eviction prevention and diversion partnerships, including legal assistance and mediation. One of the reasons this worked was the administration's actions to make eviction prevention a whole of government response, not just to help people if they're evicted, but to have the whole federal government during this crisis working to prevent evictions from even happening, inviting communities, courts, law schools to contribute their knowledge and talents to prevent evictions. We work with the Republican Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Ohio, talk about ways to get more judges involved in my state in eviction diversion efforts. These efforts just can't end now. We come out of this pandemic, the housing shortage we faced 2 years ago hasn't gotten any better. Rents are soaring, we know all too well, across the country. We can't afford to just resume business as usual with millions of families facing eviction or the possibility of eviction each year, left to fend for themselves in a rental market where they are quickly getting priced out. We need to build on the lessons we've learned during the pandemic. We need more housing that people can afford. We still need emergency rental assistance. Families haven't stopped having emergencies as we come out of the pandemic. There's no vaccine for getting laid off or to stop your car from breaking down. We need to strengthen eviction prevention in diversion systems around across the country. That's where the hundreds of you in this call come in, feeding us what we need to know, working with you in local and state governments and in associations and not-for-profits and all you're doing to work with courts and communities to prevent the damage of eviction where possible. That's why what all you do is so important. You know all too well that this problem doesn't go away on its own. We need your expertise. We need your creativity. We need your persistence to continue this work that all of us need to do. Thank you again. Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Jacob and Wally, and all of you for having me. Thank you for the work you're doing. Thanks for the invitation to participate in today's discussions. Best wishes to all of you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the policy, but also thank you for so stressing how much work there is to still be done. That is the heart of this summit, to build lasting reform. We know the challenges exist. We know that every avoidable eviction is an avoidable heartbreak, avoidable economic and emotional harm to parents, to families, to children, an unnecessary assault on economic dignity. And we appreciate how much you did for this and how much you've devoted your life to those values and causes. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Gene, and thanks to all of you.
We will now close up by turning to the special assistant for housing at the White House and the Domestic Policy Council. Erica Pothig has a broad portfolio on the housing agenda. She is the lead person at the Domestic Policy Council for all issues housing, but she was at the heart and center of everything that happened on eviction prevention. Our partner in creating the White House eviction diversion summits and bringing people together that led to so many new diversion programs. So we wanted to give Erica the last word to also, because our agenda is so much broader than this, as important as it is. And we thought we'd close with Erica, maybe giving you a sense of some of the issues that the White House is continuing to work on, and tenant protections and other things that you will hear from us and see more from us in the future. So I will give the final word to my great colleague and partner, Erica Pothig from the White House Domestic Policy Council. Erica?
Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Chairman Brown. Those were inspiring remarks. But to Jean and the American Rescue Plan team for bringing us together today, this was a remarkable program. Jean's foresight, commitment, and leadership have been so crucial to the outcomes we've discussed today, and I just want to pile on to say so. As Jean noted at the top, we first convened the White House Summit on Eviction Prevention more than a year ago with the goal of helping cities, counties, and states develop eviction prevention plans using evidence-based strategies like the ones that have been highlighted today. Now, I was very optimistic about the power of the bully pulpit and the goodwill of so many people across America to keep people housed, but it's truly remarkable to see and hear about what has been accomplished in just over a year. At the White House Domestic Policy Council, we worked in partnership with American Rescue Implementation Team and other colleagues in the administration to take this whole of government approach that Chairman Brown referenced to preventing evictions. We brought nearly every agency together to identify actions that they could take to prevent evictions. With leadership from Deputy Secretary Adeyemo and Jacob Liebenlove from the Treasury Department, they made extraordinary efforts with great results to expedite the distribution of emergency rental assistance and boost the ways in which state and local recovery funds can be used for eviction diversion. The Department of Justice, with leadership from Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta and the Attorney General himself, charted new ways to promote access to justice and use its leadership to promote eviction diversion programs by convening state courts and the deans of law schools across the US. The Department of Health and Human Services and the CDC extended the eviction moratorium 3 times during 2021 to keep people housed, prevent illness and death due to COVID. The Department of Housing and Urban Development supported the implementation of the ERA program through technical assistance, insights, advice, and extended its own policies to keep HUD-assisted tenants housed. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau offered a critical resource to help tenants find and learn about ERA programs and strengthen the enforcement of the moratorium on evictions. The Department of Agriculture worked very closely with owners of 400,000 units in rural areas across the country to ensure every possible eviction was avoided and that tenants and landlords accessed ERA. Department of Veterans Affairs extended its supportive services to veterans to all 50 states to ensure veterans could access its resources to prevent evictions. And other agencies, including the Department of Education and others, supported our efforts to connect tenants to emergency rental assistance programs. As we do on so many important policy issues, agencies linked arms across the administration and stepped up to ensure that people whose lives were most disrupted during the pandemic stayed safely housed. This type of collaboration at the federal level was replicated again and again at the state and local level. Now we are building on the successful collaboration in the next phase of our policy development and action to prevent tenants from evictions. This means doing what we can to extend the successful approaches we've been discussing today into the future and looking at other steps the administration can take to prevent evictions. I'm so grateful to the leadership of Chairman Brown in the Senate and Chairwoman Waters in the House and their teams that have been so committed and great partners in strengthening an infrastructure to prevent evictions. Today, we've been talking about how we made it through the worst parts of the pandemic to keep people stably housed. Now, coming out of that worst part of the pandemic, rents have been rising at near historic rates. Renters face a very tough housing market, and finding an affordable place to live has become more difficult. This stress is felt disproportionately by renters on limited incomes, renters of color, renters with disabilities, renters with a prior conviction. In May, the administration announced an action plan to close gaps in America's housing supply that is a major cause of these increased housing prices. This gap existed before we came into office, and it has definitely gotten worse during it due to supply chain issues and other considerations. This creates a greater imbalance between renters and their housing providers, landlords. In addition to developing ways we can keep the infrastructure to prevent evictions in place, we are also beginning new work to strengthen protections for renters. We brought together agencies like HUD and USDA who have portfolios of federally assisted properties, but also Treasury, Justice, the Department of Defense, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, Federal Trade Commission, and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to develop a whole of government approach. We've listened to tenants organized by People's Action, like TJ Hughes from Chicago, who I see on this call today, and tenant advocates from across the country, and housing providers, both large and small, to inform our strategies. We're still very early on in the development of this work, but we are approaching it with the same sense of urgency that we felt in the early days of the administration in 2021. As Jean noted, our eviction prevention work was a product of collaboration between agencies in the administration and Congress with advocates, administrators of ERA programs, state courts, mayors, governors, county executives, tribal leaders, legal aid attorneys, philanthropy, and housing providers. We will need this same type of goodwill and collaboration as we take the lessons from this crisis and create a new normal, a normal that prevents every preventable eviction, a normal that ensures rental housing is a source of stability, not a source of stress, a normal that ensures tenants can enjoy housing free of lead and other environmental hazards, a normal that ensures no renter encounters discrimination, especially on the basis of their source of income during their housing search. Jean, thank you for your leadership, for the leadership of so many across the administration, our partners from across the country. Thanks to all of you for attending today's event and for all you do to keep our neighbors housed. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
And with that, we conclude this summit. But this summit has already driven discussion of the work we still need to do, the policies that still need to be done, the additional conferences that still need to be called. So we strongly encourage that this dialogue continue. Thank you so much for attending.